Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion, with your host, Emily Schumann.
Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Sommer Fox. Sommer is a 29-year-old mental health advocate in the Denver area and the owner of Discreet Journal. She was diagnosed with severe obsessive compulsive disorder and speaks about her challenges and opportunities with mental health. All right. Well, hi, Sommer. Thanks so much for being on our podcast. We're so excited to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you guys.
So why don't you start by telling us just a little bit about yourself? What do listeners need to know about you?
Sure. So my name's Summer. I'm from the Denver area and I'm a 29-year-old gal. I grew up with pretty severe OCD that went undiagnosed for a long time, which is something that's super common for people with that mental health disorder. And just over the last several years, probably about 5 or 6 years, I've started to learn how to treat the OCD. And I've started to become really passionate about being an advocate for others who have similar diagnosis or they're having a hard time getting a diagnosis. And then just making sure people are aware of the accommodations that are available to them if they do have OCD. That's a little bit about me. I live just in Denver, like I said, with 3 cats and my husband.
And tell us about your company, Discreet Journal.
Sure. Yeah. Discreet Journal is something that I actually created, never intending for it to be a company. What happened was I started therapy several years ago, and I actually have a day job. I work in tech and I work with a lot of folks that are not very emotional, and emotions aren't really talked about at work. And I was working full time in the office at that moment. And so when I had started therapy, I wanted homework exercises, things to do between my sessions. I would feel like I would go to therapy and feel really great, leave, and then 24 hours would go by and I'd be back to kind of just this bad mental state. And so some of the books that my therapist was recommending were great, but they said things like, working on my anxiety and depression, like really big on the front cover. And I knew if I was going to be working some of that therapy work into my everyday life, I needed it to be like a routine thing, something that felt sustainable. And to me, that felt like doing it during my lunch break at work. But it felt uncomfortable to bring something like that to work with me and just like have a book like that on my desk. So what happened was I started creating my own journal prompts in a composition notebook that I had based on some of the therapy questions that my therapist would ask me. And then I would journal and answer those questions myself and bring them to my therapy session. My therapist was like, "This is actually really cool. Would you self-publish it so that I could use it with my clients?" So that is how the whole thing started.
Wow.
This was in 2019, and I self-published just towards the end of 2019. And of course, I'd been kind of talking to some of my friends about it. And then the pandemic hit, and all of my friends were like, "Hey, now I'm in a really weird mental state. Could I have one of those journals?" So I created a website and, very bare minimum just for family and friends, and posted on my personal Instagram, and it like took the site down, which was really crazy because so many people were ordering them and going to the website. They think it was a time when people were like really focusing on mental health and just like needing some support and tools. And I think just me opening up about my journey a little bit made people feel more comfortable to like, oh, if she's just like a normal girl going about life in the same way I am. And if this journal is helping her, I want to try it out. So, very long story short, we turned it into a business and started coming up with other versions of the journal. My husband and I created a couples version, and it's kind of just a way for people to get mindful and have something that's easy to take with them wherever they're going. And it's not like kind of exposing your mental health journey, because I just really feel passionate that that should be on your own terms to be able to tell people about and open up about. So yeah.
Wow, that's awesome. So, what kind of prompts are there in the journal? Like, are they just things that have been helpful to you, or are you kind of following some sort of recognized, therapeutic methodology with those prompts?
Yeah, good question. So I am not a licensed therapist. So what I do is I utilize a type of therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a really big word for honestly just mindfulness and like stress management. So the questions are really focused on getting mindful, regulating your emotions. And what I do is I kind of write up those prompts and clear them with counselors and therapists before we release them. So I don't think if you were looking at the journal, you would have any idea that we're following any sort of like therapy protocol, because they seem like very, just kind of like basic conversation starter type questions, but they actually all have a main purpose behind it. And we actually have a journal for kids, which we structured it a little bit more therapy structured around like 4 themes in DBT. There are themes in that type of therapy that are like wise mind versus emotional mind versus logical mind, and how you balance all of that, which is something that we learn as kids as we go throughout life. But a lot of adults are still mastering it. And so just kind of getting people familiar with that.
That's excellent. And I really like that you're working with therapists to kind of, balance what's worked for you and, lived experience with their kind of professional expertise. That's a really good kind of balanced approach, I think.
Thanks. My input comes in is more in like how the journal is structured, because I've had a lot of journals that have a ton of prompts, or you have to, read a lot of like literature before you answer the prompt, which I do think those serve an important value for something that feels like a long-term sustainable journaling practice. I knew that at least for me, I needed it to be less constrained. So it's really only 2 questions per day. It doesn't have like a day 1, day 2, day 3. There's just an open date field. If you skip a few days, there's no need to feel any like shame or guilt. So that's kind of where I put my personal spin on the journal, is that it's very, very simplified on purpose.
So you mentioned that, you have OCD, which for people who might not be familiar, that's obsessive compulsive disorder. What are some of the misconceptions that are out there about OCD, and kind of what are some things you wish more people knew about what it's like to live with that condition?
Yeah, this is a great question. This is something I'm so passionate about, because when I was in school, it was a step forward that we were even learning about it at all, learning about obsessive compulsive disorder and other mental health challenges. But what was provided as kind of a description of it to me was really related to like washing your hands a lot, needing your desk to be neat, and things like that. So my OCD symptoms never followed that pattern at all, actually. And it led to me having just years of misdiagnosis. I was having really like textbook OCD symptoms, but I was going into like my school counselor or like my primary care physician, and they would give me these tests. Like I can still remember this 10-question questionnaire that my PCP gave me. And the questions were like, do you wash your hands a lot? Do you shower more than once a day? Things like that, to try and diagnose with OCD. And at the end of the test, they said, nope, she doesn't have OCD. And that's because my symptoms were so wildly different from that. And there are different themes of OCD that people go through. Having some sort of like cleanliness or fear of germs can be a side effect of OCD, but like the underlying anxiety that's caused by it is usually something a lot deeper. For me, it started with, and I'll just provide a quick trigger warning, it started with somebody in my middle school um, taking their own life. And I didn't even know this person, but for whatever reason, it caused this major, what we call a spike in OCD, where I started having fears that like I would do that. And it was extremely hard to explain to my family when I was so young, like what was going on in my little brain. Cause they're like, if you don't want to do that, then just don't. And the OCD just had such a chokehold on me that like I refused to watch the news. I couldn't sleep alone. My parents slept in my room until I was 15.
Mhm.
I had a baby monitor in my room in case I woke up in the middle of the night and I felt the loss of control. I wouldn't let myself be home alone. Like so many of those kind of controlling symptoms. And when explaining that to a doctor, that doesn't match up at all with what people think is OCD. So that is kind of how it started for me. And I had different spikes throughout the years that within OCD, there's themes. So in that particular spike I was having, the theme would be harm. I was afraid of self-harm. I've had themes where I'm afraid of harming others, like being really worried as I'm driving that I might have accidentally hit somebody, things like that, where, yeah, it's that's not what you learn in school. And so it was very confusing to me and to my family. And that's, I think, another reason why journaling is so helpful, because when you're that young, you don't have the verbiage to be able to explain what's going on in your head. And so getting younger kids to be able to verbalize their feelings in a bit more of a sophisticated way other than I'm happy, I'm sad, I think is really helpful to combat some of the like misdiagnosis that goes on with mental health disorders.
Hmm. What I'm hearing is that, more people should understand that OCD isn't just about washing hands and keeping a obsessively clean house. Like it can show up in a lot of different ways. What does a day in your life look like with your OCD?
So, a day in my life prior to going through like more extensive therapy for OCD, which I'll talk about in a second, but prior to that, I would say close to 30 to 50% of my day was spent on compulsions. So, whether it's ruminating, which is just like compulsions in your mind, list making, checking, things like that, I was spending a ton of my time doing just these OCD kind of rituals throughout the day. Post going through therapy, I went through exposure response prevention therapy, which is like the gold standard for OCD. Something that's not commonly known about OCD is that traditional talk therapy can sometimes be harmful to a person with OCD because it can reiterate some of those like habitual thought patterns that are going on. And so a lot of times, going to ERP or exposure response prevention is going to be a lot more helpful for a person with OCD. So once I did that, what that means is basically exposure therapy, something that causes me a lot of anxiety. We would come up with small ways for me to expose myself to that. And I wait until my anxiety drops 2 levels. So if I'm at a 10 out of 10 on the anxiety scale, I'll do an exposure until I've dropped to an 8 out of 10, and then I can move forward. So now my day consists of doing kind of little exposures throughout the day when I have anxieties or OCD pop up. OCD is not curable, but it's manageable. And I would say that probably takes up maybe 10% of my day now, and it feels like most of the time, because I'm using those coping mechanisms, it feels like a productive use of my time versus kind of these rituals that I used to do that would take up a lot of my day. The rest of my day, the 90% of my day, looks very normal, I would say, to anybody else's day, other than I do think because I have a lot of just like mental struggles that pop up throughout the day, and I'm kind of constantly combating that with coping mechanisms. I do feel like I sleep more than the average person because person with OCD, their brain gets tired really easily. So I feel like the moment I am able to kind of relax and lay down, I'm instantly like ready to sleep. So I sleep a little bit more than probably the normal person. That would be the only difference.
Yeah. And so, you mentioned kind of just like the time consuming aspect of OCD. And, what are some other accessibility challenges you face, as compared to maybe just kind of an average typical person?
So I think those rituals that people with OCD are doing don't stay contained to your home. So at work or at school, that can be really challenging to stay focused in like a meeting or in a class. It can be really challenging there's something called false memory with OCD where you you create these memories in your mind that either you had done something or that you didn't do something that you did. So kind of navigating through that and figuring out, like, when I was younger, did I do my homework? Oh, I did my homework twice. Now I've wasted my time. So I think the biggest thing is really just that time management across all aspects of your life. And I think another struggle for a lot of people with OCD is either oversleeping or undersleeping because they're ruminating or doing rituals throughout the night. There's a lot of accessibility options for people that I had no idea about. Actually, didn't even know OCD was listed under the ADA. Like, I had no clue. So when I was in school, I did have some special accommodations. And this is before my diagnosis. So it was just trying to kind of throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. But like, I would take my tests in a separate room from other students so that I could focus better. And there's accommodations at work where I tend to be a bit more productive working from home because I'm able to kind of control some of my environment. And I'm a very social person. So I actually love being social and going into the office, but having even just a couple of days to work remotely in my adult life is really helpful because I feel like I can be a bit more productive and keep my symptoms managed if I have that time and the comfortability of like my own home.
Yeah, so tell us more about that. You just mentioned that, you didn't really know that the OCD kind of fit the definition of disability under the ADA. So when did you learn that information and, kind of how did you discover the ADA and access those protections under the law?
I had truly no idea until I was applying for jobs. There's like usually when you're applying for, I don't know, in corporate America, there's like a drop down. It'll say, do you have any disabilities? And one time I just clicked that drop down and I saw obsessive compulsive disorder on the drop down, which kind of sent me into a very interesting spiral of do I disclose this or do I not? Is it bad enough that I should tell them? What will they think? What do they do with this information? I was kind of nervous. And so that is what led me to researching like, what is the ADA? What does it protect? And why is OCD considered a disability under that? So that was my first time figuring out that there were even like laws to protect some of those accommodations that would be really helpful for me and frankly helpful for the company too, because the company wants me to be productive as well. So that was really my first time. I remember going back to therapy and being like, did you know this to my therapist? And she's like, yeah, I should have told you that. So yeah, it was kind of a shock, but also relieving at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the things that we talk about in particular around just like disability etiquette and respectful ways of treating people with disabilities is, of course, the use of language. And a lot of times, one category of things that people say that can be kind of harmful is using, psychiatric conditions like OCD in a sort of flippant way. So saying like, oh my gosh, I just had an OCD moment, or I'm so OCD, How do you feel about that? Do you find that harmful? Does that bother you, or what are your thoughts on that?
This is such a good question. I'm glad you asked. I have gone back and forth on this, so I don't know that I have like a perfect answer or a good stance on it. When I first was diagnosed, I kind of felt like I wanted to maybe dissociate from like having OCD. So when people would say like, "Oh, I'm so OCD," and then they'd say, "Oh, sorry, Summer," they would get nervous. I'd be like, "I don't care, no problem." It's like it's just a saying, it's just a phrase. And then as I've learned more about the struggles of people with OCD and gone to OCD conferences and heard stories about people who have just struggled so much trying to get a diagnosis and it's just they're so misunderstood and feel so lonely. I do think saying like, "Oh, I'm so OCD about my desk," or "I'm OCD about my house being clean," can be harmful because it just reiterates that misconception that we're all taught again that like OCD is just about cleanliness and hand washing. And it also kind of plays into the thought that it's not that serious. And I think that's really harmful to people with OCD because it can cause a lot of guilt and shame to feel like, even after I've been diagnosed, like, oh, it's just OCD. Why can't I get through my day? Why am I struggling so much? And it's not just OCD. Like OCD is a big kind of challenging monster to get through. So I think for me, I definitely, my preference is for people to avoid doing that. There's so many other ways that you can get the point across by saying, like, oh, I'm so particular about this, I'm so type A about my house being clean. Like, there's other ways to say it. I don't think it's harmful to tell people to stop saying it. But I also do recognize that I really don't think when people say I'm so OCD about this, there's any like malicious intent behind it. They just don't know. So, all that being said, when people say that, I use it as like a learning opportunity to try and say, like, oh, did you know actually many people with OCD don't even obsessively wash their hands? Like, that's just kind of a misconception. So,
Yeah, I like that. Just acknowledging that it's usually not a issue of bad intent. It's just a more of a ignorance thing. But, people can just be a little bit more precise with their language too.
Yeah, it's exactly. It's really easy to swap the word out for a different word. And so luckily most of the people in my life have now learned that, and even some days I slip up. Like as much as I know, as much as I have learned about OCD, there are times when it comes out of my mouth in that way. And so I think you just have to have grace for people and use it as a learning opportunity. And I try really hard to just assume that people mean the best. And I do think too, with a disability that's not visible, that can be challenging as well. So having to like re-explain to people like what OCD is because they can't physically see it can be like a bit exhausting sometimes. So I do think if people can try to avoid using that word as just like a misconception, it is helpful.
Yeah, and that really kind of leads into my next question, which is, you've sprinkled in some good nuggets of wisdom, as we've been talking, but, what advice do you have for other people with OCD or other people with particularly those hidden disabilities or non-apparent disabilities in general?
Yeah, community is the first word that comes to my mind. There is nothing better than finding somebody who can relate to you. It just makes you feel so much less crazy or less alone and isolated. Particularly for OCD, there are a lot of really amazing conferences out there. I try to go yearly to the OCD Game Changers conference that they put on. There's some amazing speakers. They do a lot of really cool, like therapeutic exercises. People share their stories. And that was the first time that I felt like, oh, like these are my people. Like this is my community when I went to that conference. I think there's probably a lot of opportunities, even virtually, for people to get involved with other people who have similar disabilities to them. So I think that would be like my number one recommendation. And then my number two, if people are comfortable about it, I think talking to family and friends and being really open. I like to invite people to ask me questions, even if they feel like they're going to be maybe not phrased the perfect way or it's not going to come out the right way. I would so much rather someone just ask me the question than be thinking about it in their head and maybe come up with an answer or ask one of our friends. Like I would just rather someone come to me. And so I think I try really hard to cultivate like an open dialogue with my family members and friends about OCD or about my disability so that they can feel comfortable coming to me and asking questions. And then immediately they become people who can educate beyond just me. Like I'm just one person. Now I have this network of friends and family who can also educate if somebody says, oh, I'm so OCD about this. And I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, that's great advice. So, as we get to wrapping up today, where would you most like listeners to connect with you after today's episode? And what, if anything, is kind of your call to action?
Sure. I can be found, I post a lot about my journey and love connecting with people on my business page, which is Discreet Journal. That's my journal business, but we have an Instagram account where I just post a lot of like journal prompts and therapy advice and just like a day in the life. And that's DISCREET journal. So that's our handle on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest. And then our website is discreetjournal.com. So you can find me at any of those locations. And call to action would just be, I think, for anybody, even if you have a disability or you don't have a disability, just to never assume that somebody is fully able-bodied or doesn't have a disability or isn't struggling with something, whether it's a disability recognized by the ADA or just a stressful event in their life. Everybody is going through something. And so my call to action would be just be kind and assume good intent.
And is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners or anything that we didn't ask that we should have?
I don't think so. Just thank you so much for having me. Like I said, I've listened to the podcast before and it's really feels like an honor to be able to speak amongst all of these other great people who've been on the podcast before me. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted by Emily Schumann, and Jessica Lucinia is our sound engineer. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, grant number 90DPAD0014. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.